Hi, I'll be doing a Jungian analysis on the myth of Persephone and Hades. To begin, I'm going to give a brief intro on the story and everything that goes down with it. So, this is a myth about Persephone and Hades. The myth begins with an introduction to Demeter's daughter. She's beautiful, and because of this, Demeter fears for her and seeks to shield her from the world and keep her protected and in her care at all times. One day, when Persephone is finally allowed to go somewhere without Demeter, she's picking flowers and she gets abducted by Hades. Hades saw her beauty and wanted her to be his wife. And he asked Zeus for permission to marry her, which he granted. So he basically just takes her, and Demeter is devastated by Persephone's disappearance and neglects her duties, causing all the crops and the plants to die. So Zeus has to intervene to kind of figure this out and get this all figured out so that people don't starve. And he orders Hades to return Persephone. So he gets Hermes to go to the underworld to bring her back to the castle. But Persephone, when they go, made the mistake of eating pomegranate seeds in the underworld. And in the underworld, if you eat from food from the garden to the underworld, if you eat food from there, you are forced to stay there forever. So Demeter and Hades eventually have to come to a compromise, saying that because Persephone ate the 3 seeds from the garden, she will have to stay for 3 months out of the year in the underworld, and then for the rest of the months she can spend them with her mother. So the myth says that that's why we have winter, because winter is when Demeter is sad and separated from her daughter, and then eventually the sun comes back because Demeter is reunited with her daughter. And then, so in this myth, the dream, looking at it from the Jungian perspective of we need a dreamer. So I think the dreamer is Persephone. So this myth is about the overprotected daughter of Demeter, who is Persephone, and how she comes to be queen of the underworld, ruling alongside Hades. So the dreamer of this myth would be Persephone, because her psyche is primarily represented in this myth. She goes through significant transformations from the beginning to the end, changing from an overprotected child to someone with power and someone who's a ruler alongside Hades in the underworld. Kind of experience this new freedom, and yeah, she's like the biggest transformation in the story, so that's why I think she fits the role of dreamer. Other archetypal roles, starting with the shadow. The textbook said that the shadow is usually the same sex as the dreamer, but in this myth, I would say that Hades is the shadow of Persephone. I looked into it, and it said that it didn't have to be gender-bound, so I hope that's alright and everything. But Hades sort of represents all things hidden and feared to Persephone. It's very scary, very different from the life that she's in. And so that's kind of like her unconscious self. Those are the unconscious parts of herself. She doesn't want to explore that. She wants to push it away. And he's the ruler of the dead, it's all darkness and depth, and Persephone is, in her consciousness, the youthful and innocent, and kind of doesn't have a lot of experience in the world. She's coming from the mother of all things living, and now she's interacting with this man who's the ruler of the dead. So that is a big kind of shift from, her conscious to her unconscious. And Hades draws Persephone into this unconscious, where she grows and is transformed because of her confrontation with these unconscious parts of herself. And she goes from innocent Persephone to queen of the underworld, which is a huge thing for the shadow to awaken in her, that other part of herself. And then each story has an anima or an animus, and since our main character is a female, the animus is going to be a male. So I also think that the role of animus should go to Hades, and Jung said that these roles sometimes they overlap or blend. So I think this is a case where Hades can serve as both the shadow and the animus. He kind of does both of them, shifts from one to the other. So I'm of the belief that Hades fits the role of both animus and the shadow, because he represents all the unconscious masculine qualities that Persephone has not yet encountered or developed. Which kind of goes back to what I was just saying, how Persephone is very innocent. She's been hidden away from the world her whole life. She's been overprotected by her mother. And then Hades is powerful and brutal, and he's the ruler of the underworld, so it's all this scary stuff she's never encountered before. And he takes her with him to this place, and he forces her out of her role and shapes her identity into something that resembles kind of his role, because she becomes queen with him. So he represents her own personal change and development as she goes towards maturity, and becoming these other hidden parts of herself are coming more to the surface. And then the next role that Jung mentioned is the self. And the self of this myth, I would say, is Zeus. Zeus he's at the center of everything. He's the main god in most myths with in Greek mythology. And so he's at the center of all these events and conflicts, and he's at the center of the psyche of the story. He's the one who's allowing Hades to marry Persephone in the first place. Hades goes to him for guidance on the situation after he saw Persephone with Demeter in the garden. And then he also stands in to settle the argument between Hades and Demeter over Persephone, when they're both trying to fight for her to be part of their lives. And he oversees both the overworld, which can represent the conscious mind, and then he also oversees the underworld, which can represent the unconscious mind. He steps into the unbalance, and he gives harmonies to both sides of the story, both sides of Persephone's self. He kind of balanced it all out for all the characters. And then stages of the myth. I would say stage 1 could be considered the pre-psychological development stage. So this is when Persephone is living under the protective care of her mother, but she's kind of seeking independence. She goes out and picks flowers. And I think this stage represents or symbolizes innocence, harmony, and safety. Stage 2 of the myth, I would classify as the crisis stage. This is when Persephone is kidnapped by Hades and taken into the underworld. And this stage symbolizes a descent into the unconscious, unknown parts of the self, or of Persephone, the dreamer. And then stage 3, I would call psychological development. This is when Persephone is given lots of gifts by Hades and even a position at equal side of him, ruling as queen of the underworld. This stage to me represents transformation and immersion into the unconscious. And then stage 4 is the intervention stage. This is when Demeter grieves the absence of her daughter and Zeus has to intervene in order to restore order. This stage symbolizes how the outward is affected by the inward changes, like how Persephone's change is affecting the outside world. And then stage 5 is permanent transformation. This is when Persephone eats from the garden of the underworld, and this stage represents how once you encounter the unconscious, you cannot forget what you've seen or return to how things were. And then the last stage, stage 6, I would say is called time. This is when Persephone will rule for 3 months in the underworld and then spend the other 9 months in the overworld with her mother. It's kind of like the resolution. And this stage symbolizes the combination of the conscious and the unconscious parts of the psyche and how the rest of the time will be. So now if I had to retell the story symbolically, I would say that it starts with Persephone, and she closes her eyes and she slips into a dream without even realizing it. And it's a peaceful dream, of course, exactly how her dreams should be. She's picking flowers in a gorgeous field, finally allowed a little distance from her mother, Demeter, who has overprotected her for as long as she can remember. She ate pomegranates and rested peacefully in perfect serenity. She didn't know it, but the shadow was there. He had already been lurking for a long time, watching her even when she was with her mother. He noticed her innocence and beauty and wanted to take her and show her the other parts of herself. After gaining permission from the self to marry her, he decided to take action. He struck, and Hades took Persephone from her peace into the underworld. Persephone initially rejected and feared the death and darkness that the shadow had brought to her attention. She tried to flee, and he tried to make her happy with gifts, but she rejected all of this, until he went from the shadow to the Animus. Hades, as the Animus, powerful ruler of the dead, offered her power. She could rule alongside him as queen of the underworld. Persephone hesitated, but took the power. She ruled and even made meaningful changes, such as the addition of Elysium to the underworld. While Persephone bloomed in the underworld, everything died in the overworld. Her mother was overcome by grief, searching for her, so that she neglected her other duties. She refused to allow plants to grow and bloom until her daughter was back where she belongs, the peace of the conscious. The self saw all of this and intervened, telling Hermes to fetch Persephone and bring her back to Demeter. But it was too late. Persephone ate from the garden of the underworld, binding her to this new unconscious part of herself forever. The self created a compromise to satisfy both Demeter and the shadow / Animus. Persephone would live 3 months of the year in the underworld and the rest with her mother. While Persephone is with her mother and things are perfect as they should be, plants bloom and thrive. But while she's away in the depths of her unconscious self and desires in the underworld, everything withers and dies. So that is my retelling, and that is my Jungian analysis of the myth of Persephone and Hades. Thank you for listening.